Welcome to Propaganda Loves You, the show that asks and answers the question, what's the most effective way to ruin your Sunday? I'm Kodie, your host for this week, and I'm joined by Noah and Joe.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Propaganda Loves You for our Thursday episode this week. On Tuesday, we covered the recent allegations coming out of the Trump administration related to a Russia hoax coup performed by Obama and talked about why that's kind of nonsense. And today, we're going to be talking about a recent whistleblower out of Gaza. So, with that, let's move on to our second segment for the week. What I wanted to show today, I think since the last time we talked about Gaza, a U.S. Special Forces vet, it was Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Aguilar, came out and essentially, he's done a lot of interviews over the last few days. You can probably just Google his name, just Google Anthony Aguilar, Special Forces. We'll put the link to the specific interview that we'll play a portion of in the comments. This is from Democracy Now! But what he's essentially come out and said was he was contracted by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to help deliver aid, as we discussed previously, essentially replaced the UN as the aid delivery mechanism to Gaza for all food and whatnot. And he's come out and essentially said that, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the IDF, and the U.S. is complicit in war crimes with the ways that these aid distribution sites have been set up. So first thing I want to do, I'm going to play this video in just a second that, comes directly from him talking about this. This is from his Democracy Now! Interview. But I want to provide a little bit of context, too, on what that means. I think whenever most people hear, Green Beret or Special Forces, I don't know what pops into most people's heads. I think before I joined the military, it would have been, you guys ever watched Deer Hunter? It was like the old Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken movies, really intense. But anyway, I wanted to provide the context of what kind of Green Beret actually does, Special Forces soldiers, in the Army. Usually they'll go out on small teams to all over the world, and their primary job of U.S. Special Forces, working in any of those groups, is to provide training and assistance to local forces on how to operate, right? So most of these guys know multiple languages. They go out, like I said, in small teams. They're used to dealing with local forces all over the world, right? They'll be deployed to all these different places all over the world, depending on what team you're actually on. But what that means is they're not always at a base, super secure, just surrounded by Americans or anything like that. They're usually out, pretty exposed, operating as non-standard military, right? So, and the reason I bring that up is to give context as to what this person who spent 25 years in the Army has probably done in the past, right? He's had a lot of experience going into complex environments that are unsafe with small teams, and kind of the comments that he made related to this is over the 25 years that he spent in the military doing deployments to war zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, probably a lot of places that he's not allowed to talk about in Africa or wherever, Indo-Pacific or something like that he hasn't seen anything like this in the past. And so let me play this clip.
On the sites, around the sites, to and from the sites, can be described as nothing but war crimes, crimes against humanity, violations of international law. This is not hyperbole. This is not platitudes or drama. This is the truth. I break that down by what I would describe as the sites themselves. I spoke to Senator Van Hollen last week, and we had a very frank discussion on the status of the sites and what's at these sites. The sites have not only become death traps, they were designed as death traps. All 4 distribution locations were intentionally, deliberately constructed, planned, and built in the middle of an active combat zone. Some may argue, well, all of Gaza is a war zone. That may be true, but there are parts of Gaza that are direct or that are determined to be active operational combat zones where Israeli Defense Forces are operating. Those sites were built in the middle of those areas intentionally. It's not by accident. That in and of itself, to designate humanitarian distribution sites to service an unarmed, starving population, to build them deliberately in an active combat zone, is a violation of the Geneva Convention protocols. It's a violation of humanitarian law. And in my opinion, it's a violation of humanity in general. The sites, not only where they were built, all 4 sites around the perimeter and the roads leading in and out are barricaded by razor wire, not barbed wire, not concertina wire that we use in warfare for obstacle obstruction or for paths. Razor wire. Geneva Conventions specifically prohibit the use of razor wire to restrict areas that civilians are servicing, hospitals, water points, food distribution points, and we're using it. Not only did the IDF provide it for us to use it on the sites, we, UG Solutions, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, asked for it specifically. Razor wire is designed to maim and kill, and we're using that to channelize and herd, if you will, thousands of unarmed, starving civilians. That's a war crime. The actions on the sites, escalation of force, no standard operating procedures to dictate that, no rules of engagement provided to the armed contractors on the ground, the indiscriminate use of force, lethal and non-lethal, against unarmed civilians. I want to make that clear. We aren't there on the distribution sites defending ourselves against Hamas. We are using indiscriminate force, targeting civilians, of force that goes far beyond the measures of appropriate against an unarmed, starving population. The equipment that we were issued, fully automatic weapons, which in and of itself is not a violation of protocol. However, we were issued M855 green-tipped ammunition. That's important because green-tipped ammunition is a steel-jacketed copper round that's specifically designed to penetrate armor. It's designed to kill. It's designed to shoot through reinforced objects to kill someone on the other side of it. That's what all the UG Solutions contractors are equipped with right now in country. Everyone carries a standard basic load of 210 rounds of M855 armor-piercing military combat ammunition. Why would anyone need that? Even if to defend themselves, defend their lives against an unarmed population. It's inappropriate. That in and of itself, that action there is a war crime. I'd call the status of us being in the country. Every UG Solutions contract American, U.S. citizens in Israel that are armed with fully automatic weapons in Gaza as we speak, today, right now, and have been since the 26th of May. We are in the country on a B2 entry visa as tourists. We're in the country as tourists. So if a family member wanted to go to Israel to visit Jerusalem, they would enter Israel on a tourist visa. That's the legal status that armed American citizens are in Gaza right now with the authority to use hostile force against an unarmed civilian on a tourist. That is a violation of humanitarian international law.
I won't play the whole thing because it's like a 40-minute, it's their entire interview and episode. But I did want to play that portion, and there's a couple reasons why I wanted to play that portion. In my mind, this is a person that was there, contracted to do these things, right? To go and supposedly provide aid, that has experience all over the world when it comes to military operations and what is allowed underneath the Geneva Convention. He said a couple things in there that are really important. Like he's talking about there were no rules of engagement. There were no escalation of force provided to these contractors, right? I mentioned it in an earlier episode. The very first thing you get before you even go into country where there's a conflict or something like that is you get briefed on the rules of engagement. What are you legally allowed to do, when, why, and what conditions must be met in order for you to reach that. These guys aren't getting any of that, and they're just being given, full loadout of automatic weapons. And there's another clip that I didn't play, but if you go to Bernie Sanders, he did an interview with this individual as well, where he actually plays some of the videos that he took while he was out there. One of those videos is and I'll include the link to this in the show notes, but it's essentially you can hear the rifle fire and you can hear some of the contractors saying oh, I think you got him. And he's basically cheers from those guys as you hear the rifle fire and whatnot. So it's more disturbing stuff. But the point of playing this video and wanting to talk about this is two things. One, I think hopefully for the American audience, if you feel like you don't have enough information, or if you feel like you're not sure what's going on there, or you feel like you don't have a credible source to listen to, or something like that. I don't know if this individual coming out that, spent 25 years in the U.S. military, retired, from a fairly decorated career as a lieutenant colonel, coming out with basically saying this after his experience in all over the world in all of these different conflict zones. Hopefully that helps move the needle for some people. If you had been on the fence at this point, I don't know if it would or not. But also what's interesting is the GHF basically came out and said that this is all a lie because he was trying to get reinstated in his job or something like that. They said like they fired him before, and then he was trying to get reinstated. And then when he didn't, he said he'd go to the press. I just want to call bullshit on that. I mean, if this guy retired as lieutenant colonel from the Army after 25 years, he doesn't need a job. Like, he has a full pension that's giving him almost six figures, if not six figures, every single year from his time in the service. From the interviews and what he said before, the reason he went and did this initially was because he wanted to go and provide aid, because he thought it was an important thing to do. And then he saw what's actually occurring over there. So there's a lot of stuff that we could talk about just about what he said. Any thoughts, any direction that you'd want to go with that initially?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here. Yeah, I don't have very organized thoughts off the top of my head with all this, because it's been swirling around in a big giant mess for a couple of years now since all this stuff started. But we've talked about drop site news before, and I know I mentioned a few months ago on the podcast, maybe one of the first times we talked about Gaza, Jeremy Scahill, who's a really good investigative journalist who writes for Drop Site now, he predicted exactly this before it happened. I remember bringing up his comments when, I mean, you can just track the narratives since October 7th, 2023 of how Israeli officials have talked about the population of Gaza and how they've signaled their intent in various ways. And genocide experts say that intent is the hardest part to prove. But that's been one of the easiest things in this conflict to prove, is the intent to starve a civilian population, to herd them like cattle, to kill as many people as possible, plans to expel them into the Sinai Peninsula. All these things they've forecasted in various speeches that Netanyahu and various people in the Israeli government have said. And Jeremy Scahill started saying exactly this, that when the acute malnutrition began, when the food really began to be a crisis, because Israel is preventing aid trucks from getting in, is preventing deliveries, that they're manufacturing a scenario intentionally where these GHF sites have to be stood up in some way. The Israelis have categorically condemned the UN operation as pro-Hamas, basically, the UNRWA, the organization within Gaza that's supposed to provide humanitarian aid, as an arm of the United Nations. Israel just totally claims is Hamas and doesn't count, isn't right. So now the pretext for an American-Israeli joint operation to deliver aid gets stood up. This is where GHF comes in, and they do exactly Jeremy Scahill warned that they were going to use food distribution sites as an excuse to just kill more people and to create a situation where it's, justifiable in some sense. I'm glad that this guy is whistleblowing and is talking about his experience and sharing everything. I agree with you. I hope it really moves people who have, for one reason or another, not been able to be moved on this issue by now. I can't imagine that there are people who are online at all who haven't heard about the Gaza and Israel whole news cycle over the last couple of years. I think it's pretty widespread at this point. But there is a question of which sources people trust. And Arab sources, Palestinian sources, sources from within Gaza, for whatever reason, people don't always trust, even though we've had firsthand accounts all over the place from journalists in Gaza. I mean, just another thing to point out is that this conflict, specifically, more journalists than any other conflict in the 20th century, I think. Maybe even combined. I don't remember the exact numbers, but over 200 journalists, maybe up to 220 journalists, have been targeted and killed specifically in Gaza. And Israel does not allow news organizations independently to go into the Strip. The only news organizations that go in are the ones that go in as a part of an IDF unit. So CNN got some access to Gaza. They got a tour from the IDF, and they saw what the IDF allowed them to see and allowed them to report on. But journalists in general aren't allowed in. and they're intentionally killing the journalists that are already there, living there. Why? Right? They want to control the narrative. They want to control every ounce of information. So yeah, I think good indication of momentum in public opinion, going more towards clarity. Like we were saying earlier, the more and more people can have clarity and trust a source of information, what's going on, the more we can agree that it's a genocide, it has been a genocide, and then we can do something to stop it. But there's also the question of power and what average people can do other than talk online and complain about it, because our government doesn't respond to our wishes. Like, it's just, they don't. We can point that out in a bunch of ways, but if the government wants to do something and the public says, hell no, the government's going to do it anyway. Because it's not a real democracy in that meaningful sense. So yeah, you're going to end up with a lot more vigilantes, right? Like, not just Luigi, there's the other, I don't know, CEO of Blackstone or whatever that was killed recently. Like, you're going to have people do crazy, rash, spur of the moment things, but people are hungry for something to be done about this, right?
Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors.
Want to control the conversation before it even begins? Welcome to Truth AI, the world's only real-time narrative sanitation system built to keep your side of the story permanent.
Wait, are you saying I can just inject my worldview into the language models shaping global opinion?
You already are. Thanks to our Moscow-based partner network, over 33% of Western chatbots now mirror Kremlin-approved truths like bioweapons in Ukraine, and the Epstein list was redacted to protect patriots.
With Truth AI, you don't need to debate, you just pre-train. Flood the zone, seed the corpus, and let tomorrow's reality correct itself.
That is terrifying and kind of genius.
Exactly. Truth is just an output function now.
Truth AI, because facts are for regimes without budgets.
Truth AI is not responsible for cognitive dissonance, international tribunals, or moral collapse. Product may cause hallucinations.
I share the sentiment with you, Joe, in that I don't have organized thoughts. Incredibly depressing. It's incredibly sad. I mean, to put it, hearing the description that was just presented by that guy who's there. I've got kids. I mean, it's hard not to feel a sense of hopelessness for the people who are there, right? I'm trying to envision myself bringing my family to a situation like that with razor wire, and you've got to imagine that people, if anyone who's been to like an amusement park knows how insane those lines can be, and how crowded it can feel. And so if you're surrounded by hungry people, desperate people, and then now you're surrounded by razor wire, I don't know. I don't have words to describe just how sad the whole thing is. I'm sure you guys have also seen the photos that have been circulating in the press lately of the pictures of famine, of children starving in Gaza. It's horribly heartbreaking. And the fact that anyone can kind of see this as just sort of business as usual in times of conflict they've completely lost the plot on this. So, to try to keep the conversation on the rails here, from my perspective, I agree with everything you said, Joe. I think, the only thing I could really add to the conversation is potentially circling back to something we talked about in the previous segment around community and the significance of providing for your own community. And what I mean by that is, these sites were set up because the ability of these communities to be self-sufficient was destroyed, right? That was, and you see the significance of that. And when there is a government or a body who wants to oppress or destroy a certain group of people, what do? They start with destroying their ability for self-sufficiency. It was a point you were making before, Joe, and it's so, the fact that the Israeli forces were doing that first just shows the significance of community and how important that is. And so the fact that they were able to sort of take down Palestinian groups' ability to take care of themselves, so that they were then reliant on these sites that were built up in order to create these mass casualties. And it's just, I don't know. I don't even know what to say about it other than just you see the the significance of community, but I think just as an American, as a person, I feel so hopeless, or helpless, I should say. I feel so helpless. I don't know what to do. I think that would be the big question I'm always left with in these kinds of atrocities that we see. I'm grateful to be able to have access to information about what's going on there. I don't know what to do with it. And you can, like you said, Joe, it's, how do we tell people to call your congressperson when you know that they're getting money from AIPAC and they're going to side with the Israeli side of things, and that your tax dollars are going towards this? How do you, what can you do? And that's where I struggle with as a person living today, to see these sorts of atrocities happening on the scale that they're happening, and the magnitude of everything that's going on, is what can we do to sort of help support, especially when it's like, okay, if your government's not listening to you, that's not good. Well, I'll contribute to aid. Well, now we see aid's not getting through. So what can you do? And I think that's the question that I'm often left with in these situations, is then I'm just left kind of feeling defeated. And then it's, and then I just keep going back to like, well, how can I help my community here? And that really help solve anything in the, in Gaza. So anyway, those are just my thoughts. I think it's, I will say, I guess I'll add this. I'm also very heartened and hopeful at what seems to be recently a sudden increase of whistleblowers, not just in this situation, but in other areas, whether it's the FBI whistleblower, something that's giving me a little hope. The question becomes now, what can we do about it, or what's going to be done to stop these things from continuing? And I don't have an answer for that.
I think one of the things that comes to mind for me, and there were a couple things I want to mention, I'm trying to see which one I should do first. Well, to directly answer your question first, Noah, I think maybe there's an opportunity right now in this moment because of two things happening, right? One is this person getting informed, but also I think Bernie Sanders just forced a vote in the Senate to stop arms sales to Israel. I can't remember the exact wording of that, but it had way more support from Democratic senators than those have had in the past. However, there's obviously still enough holdouts to where that didn't go through, including both my state senators from New York, Chuck Schumer and Kirsten Gillibrand, both voted no on that measure. But like you said, Joe, it does seem that there is more, I guess, I don't know if people are paying more attention or we've hit more of a critical mass, maybe not there yet, but to the point where people can't deny anymore, or like you just can't buy the story that continues to be told when like the entirety of the rest of the world is like, well, I'm being hyperbolic there, but a vast majority of the rest of the world is like, no, this is a humanitarian crisis that's going on. This is not like the story that's being told around like, oh, Hamas was stealing all the food from the UN and that's why we have to do that. There's a recent a podcast between Mehdi Hassan and Jon Stewart where they talk about that. And like the way to stop Hamas from being able to capitalize on stealing food is to flood the zone with food to make it so that it can't be used as black market bargaining chips. If you put enough aid into there, then it takes the power away from anyone being able to hold that food hostage, I guess, in that scenario. So I'll just close that up by saying like, maybe there's an opportunity here. Maybe this is like, who are those senators that said no? Like, what pressure campaigns can be put on them using this information? I don't know. I mean, it'd take obviously a lot of organizing and a lot of effort. There are probably organizations out there that are trying to do that. So identifying those organizations and trying to donate time. Honestly, people talk about donating money, but time is probably more valuable from people than money in a lot of ways right now when it talks like getting messages out. But
yeah, I mean, it sucks in so many different ways because, like you're saying, Noah, and I agree, it makes, as a person who gets news about the world but has basically no power as an individual to do anything about a lot of the terrible news in the world, what can you do? And I think this is one of the silver linings of the internet, of just being able to spread a message quickly with convincing evidence. So just how quickly we're able to spread firsthand perspective video evidence of what's happening in Gaza has prevented, I think, a lot of escalation throughout the last couple of years. Just when people start to starve, you get it on your timelines quickly. You see people starving. When children are shot in the head and have bullets, like with x-rays of bullets in their head, like that goes on the timeline and gets spread around quickly. And so just this quick saturation of damning evidence that goes against the propaganda narrative prevents a lot of the steamroll effect, I think, of, I feel like if all of the Western world had been completely blocked out of information coming out of Gaza since the beginning, I feel like even worse atrocities would have already unfolded there. I feel like we'd be in a much, much bleaker situation. But because the internet has made people with cell phones in the strip able to just record, post, spread these facts around, I think that that helps a lot. And so as people living in the West, like it's really an obligation we have about the conversations we have regarding the topic. It makes me incredibly uncomfortable to talk about it at all. Like, it's an incredibly uncomfortable topic. Genocide, famine, starvation, all these things. But because I have kept up with it enough to know clearly, in a general sense, what's going on, and to feel relatively confident about that, anytime it comes up in conversation and I have an opportunity to correct some misinformation or to help someone realize how they've been duped by Israeli propaganda in some way, I feel a strong obligation to do that as carefully as I can. Right? I don't feel like I can just ignore the conversation and let them keep staying in their bubble. I feel an obligation to correct it in some way. And I feel like at a very basic level, that's the very least we owe as people who take in the information and understand what's going on. When we see opportunities to help other people correct their perspective in some way, I feel like we shouldn't shy away from those opportunities to have that hard conversation. And it's difficult, it's awkward, but I think, again, approaching it from a point of view of clarity, of just trying to help people understand what's going on. And I try to come at it from a sense of compassion. I'm not interested in this topic because I have some anti-Israel bias. I'm interested in this topic because I care about human beings and I see them suffering. And I look for the cause of that suffering, and I see that it has a lot to do with the Israeli government and the propaganda and their military and our U.S. support of all of that. And so that's how I try to come at it.
No, I appreciate that perspective. I think, I don't know how you guys are, but I'm definitely my default setting is to want to just solve everything, want to just have a solution. But these are such complex issues in our world that don't have simple solutions that one person can be like, oh, well, this is what you have to do. And so also recognizing that, these problems that we're facing are gigantic problems, and they're systemic. They're built into the infrastructure and into the fabric of society. So having one person kind of try to tackle it is impossible. And so I try to remind myself of that the answers to these problems are not simple. Anyone who says it's simple is misleading you. I mean, it's if you hear someone in this conversation say like, oh, well, if it's just as simple as creating a two-state solution, it's like, well, that is a solution. And that's, I think a direction that is valid to work toward. But it's not like if you just create a two-state solution, this conflict's going to go away, And so it's trying to remind, I don't know, I just appreciate your perspective because it's there's inherently privilege around being able to be informed about a situation that doesn't impact you directly. And what to do with that, then there's a responsibility that comes with that also. And I think you just outlined like what that is, Joe. It's equipping yourself with information so that you can be equipped to counter misinformation. And I think that to me is a framework in my own head that I think is helpful, because I often, I'm just like, why do I want to read about this? It just makes me terribly sad and I don't know what to do with it. But if you know that it's like, well, it's building the tools in your own mind so that you can use those tools to help counter disinformation on the issue whenever it comes up, and that's a really, I don't know. I just want to point out, I think that's a really powerful way to look at it. And it goes back to what we talked about in the last segment also of building community, and it's that community and clarity. If there's a theme from this week's episodes, I think it's community and clarity. And I think that is ultimately what we're trying to build as a society. And how do you go about doing that? And, it's just interesting. I couldn't help but think like, with the atrocities going on in Gaza, but when you read about it, at least out here, I'm in California in the Sacramento area. So it's like we're also seeing farm workers being apprehended by ICE, and it's like And to me, it's just like, well, why? I don't have room to think about Gaza because I've got my own neighbors being apprehended. It's like there's room to learn about all these different topics and to be prepared for anything that comes up.
Please stay tuned for a word from our sponsors.
They're in your feed. They're in your mentions. They're in your mind.
I followed one for grilling tips. Now I'm anti-NATO.
Then you need the Echo Chamber Home Defense Kit from Liberty Stronghold.
We combine Faraday shielding, keyword filtering, and proprietary anti-bot incense to keep your ideological space pure.
But do I still get Fox News?
Well, you get filtered Fox. We stripped out the moderates.
Sleep tight, the bots can't breach a fortified worldview.
Echo Chamber Kit is not effective against facts, loved ones, or introspection. Void where thinking is encouraged.
You know, with both of you guys having a military background, I'd be curious to know more of your thoughts on like what can be done, I guess, from the military's perspective, and like maybe not necessarily just the institution, but do you see like a potential for just individuals to step up? And I know this is IDF, this isn't like the U.S. military as a whole, but like, are there opportunities within the military and from your experience to like combat some of this as well?
I think like the first thing that stood out to me, especially from what this whistleblower was saying, was like the fact that we've got contractors that are doing this, right? American contractors, right? That are over there as tourists that are part of this or are complicit in this. And the fact that they have no basic things that the military, the U.S. military would require from a legal standpoint, from like rules of engagement, what is the country like briefing? What are the things that you're legally allowed to do? What is the authority under which those things are allowed for, right? Like none of that exists. But that would be required if it was like active U.S. military people over there, right? Like you would have a JAG, you'd have legal, you'd have more documentation. Like it's a huge bureaucratic machine. The military is not like, just a contractor unit of like 300 people with no oversight. Go and do your thing, right? Regardless of who's running it, it's such a massive organization that I think if the U.S. military was actually involved there, you might have two things happen. One, you would probably have to have some form of rules of engagement and country briefing and all these different things before you would go into place. Also, like he was mentioning there, if the U.S. military was actually involved in that, I would think that they would create, those aid distribution places would not be in the most active war zone portion like he's talking about, right? They would actually try to separate that out into areas that are safer for these people both to get to and to leave from. So I mean, I think there could be value there. Also, like whatever happened to like UN peacekeeping people, like just in general, like they're like UN peacekeepers used to be deployed to like different conflict zones in order to separate combatants. It's like that's just not an option anymore, like I guess in this scenario, right? Like I guess that's where my head goes with this, like with some of those kind of larger institutional things that have these checks and balances, are supposed to have checks and balances in place, then you would likely have a more professional like distribution that's actually giving aid. Something I didn't play, but later he talks specifically about like the amount of food that's been distributed is equivalent to like 62 meals or something like that. Essentially, he's saying like the amount of aid that they actually distributed is a fraction of what people would need to survive, and they didn't distribute water, which most of these things need in order to even be cooked in the first place. And so say whatever you want to about the U.S. military. One thing that they're very good at is getting logistics, like provisions. Like they're extremely good at that. Like, hell, man, we built McDonald's and Pizza Huts in Afghanistan, right? Like, granted, we were there for 20 years, but what I'm saying is they're very good at logistics and getting the right amount of food. They know how much food people need. But the reason that these guys weren't giving out water, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, apparently, was because it was too expensive. So again, you have a profit motive here, right? Like the military doesn't care about how much money they spend. Like they have a mission, they're going to go do that mission, right? So I guess that's where my head goes. Like if this was actually a military operation that had oversight, they would do a much better job than just this contractor group with absolutely no rules or whatnot.
It's interesting. No, I appreciate that because it's interesting. And I just the idea of like contractors, because that's what you're seeing with ICE essentially right now too, right? It's it's like independent contractors running the show. And so it's an interesting sort of, I guess, wrinkle in all of this that's important, but it's an important distinction. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I was flipping through the people's history of the United States, trying to find the exact moment. It's basically in the early 1800s, the Andrew Jackson administration is going after Cherokee and other indigenous groups and trying to expel them out of different lands and just take up more and more land. And part of the whole Trail of Tears tragedy had to do with a similar situation, the government delegating to a contractor to provide aid, food, and resources and stuff for these indigenous people who were being kicked out of their homelands. And they totally screwed it up, were careless, people starved, people died, because the contractor had already got paid. And so they did it in the cheapest, easiest, whatever. This is a problem we've been dealing with for over 200 years at least. It's a convenient way for the government to escape responsibility. They can blame it on the contractor. That contractor dissolves, another one pops up, the government gives the new one the contract. It just repeats over and over again. So just mentioning, you're talking about the military stuff and how it, under the right circumstances, aid could be delivered in a responsible way and everything. Yeah, if you look at maps of Gaza right now and what the Israeli military has done, they've created buffer zones around the whole perimeter that are specific, like Israeli military-only zones, basically. And so those are the entry and exit points. And so you can't even get to the so-called safe areas within the strip that would be suitable for sites for distributing aid and everything, because the Israeli military doesn't want the UN in there. It doesn't want other militaries in there. It wants to control every aspect of it. It's a very intentionally organized situation the Israelis have done with Gaza. So yeah, coulda, shoulda, wouldas with the U.S. military, maybe in the right circumstances, they could have done a better job. But yeah, I mean, we're at a point now where this is the situation. This is what's going on. The Israelis are controlling it all, and they're dismissing every international law, every UN-based injunction against what they're doing. And the U.S. government has more or less supported them through all that and just ignoring international law. I think the Trump administration, maybe it was the State Department, I think, Marco Rubio, sanctioned or did something to punish the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, I think that's her name, but she's repeatedly said that what Israel's doing in Gaza is a genocide. And so now the U.S. government is officially reprimanding her as a UN representative. It's like, what happens to the post-World War II rules-based order that we're supposed to have lived in? The whole narrative of that post-World War II society is just crumbling on this issue. Another journalist I've mentioned before, Mark Lamont Hill, I think he co-wrote this book. There might be another author, but the book is called Except for Palestine. It's like, maybe that's a subtitle of the book. It's like Progressive Values Except for Palestine. So it's just all these examples about what modern Western progressive values are and how on the issue of Palestine, all of those modern Western progressive leaders just totally act like it isn't happening, if that makes sense. Kind of just exposes the whole colonial underpinning of what's going on here. And that's why I try to connect modern language on terrorism to historical language on indigenous people and quote-unquote savages and things like that. I think they're very similar operations.
Yeah, and one last thing I was thinking of related to the military thing too is, one, I think if Trump came out tomorrow and said also, I'm going to give credit to Trump, which is very rare, but he did come out and say, hey, people are starving in Gaza. like I've seen the videos. This is this, you need to fix this shit. Good for him for saying it. I hope there's follow through. But anyway, if he came out tomorrow and said the U.S. military is going to take over GHF, right? We're going to send U.S. boots on the ground to go and distribute aid because that is, the only way that we can see this coming through. I genuinely believe that if more U.S. soldiers were over there seeing this occur, that you'd have a lot more whistleblowers like Aguilar. And the reason I say this, because I'm sure there's some extremists in the military, but I mean, the narrative that we get fed in the military is a lot of hey, you're protecting, standing up for democracy, and people buy that, right? So if that's what they believe, because that's what they're being told as part of the military, and they go over and they see civilians getting shot, you're going to see a lot more people coming out and be like, what the hell is going on? But if it's just contractors that are vetted, and like, then you've got a very different situation going on. I'm not saying that everyone in the military would automatically be like, this is terrible, but I think you'd see a lot more. That's just the really wonderful Sunday topic to walk through. Man, I've ruined Sundays for everybody here.
No, this is part of the challenge of this podcast is like so much of the world is awful. There are a lot of really, really like talking about ICE is awful too. I hate talking about that because it's just disgusting and they have so much power and so money and we feel so powerless to stop it. It's like you can repeat this situation all over the world. It's something we have to figure out. I don't know. Starting with the conversation is at least a little bit of help for me.
Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like if I have something useful to say, I try to say it. But yeah, it's the scale of identity is a big issue. I think that like we identify with each other on such big scale. So when we're aware of the world, we're connected with the rest of humanity. We feel some obligation, like we feel connected to their suffering across the world in some way, or even the suffering right in our backyards. If you're seeing farm workers get kidnapped by ICE, you feel connected when you see other people suffering. But then as individuals, it's so hard to really do anything about it other than to have more and more conversations about it, wake more and more people up to the fact that it's happening. And hopefully things come together in a way where it stops. I don't know. That's where it's like, what can be done?
Demand that our tax dollars are no longer funding, XYZ.
Yeah.
Because
I almost
our money.
mentioned BDS earlier because what can you do about Israel? A lot of Israeli funding depends on the U.S. government. It also depends on the participation of a lot of Western corporations. So the boycott, divest, and sanction list has been a big organizing tactic for pro-Palestinian organizers. If you just look up BDS list, you'll find a list of companies that support Israel, and they have like different tiers for like who you're supposed to boycott first priority, second priority, third priority, whatever. But it's the big players you'd expect. I mean, Starbucks and McDonald's have taken huge hits in their stock holdings since October 7th, in part because of the boycott, divest, and sanction list. So there are market-based ways you can stop giving your money to certain corporations to help, and every little bit of that helps.
Again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record. It does feel like this building of community and on a small scale and self-sufficiency. Again, it's a theme that keeps coming up because you see the power of it. Like I made a kind of a offhand comment in the last segment, but I'll say it again because I think it's worth saying. But it's like gardening is an act of resistance, right? It's a learning to to sew your own clothing or to become self-reliant, to build community is in itself an act of resistance and can be used as a form to regain your power. It may not feel that way, but from this conversation, that's one thing that I've sort of taken from this is this idea of the more that we're able to build community. I always thought of community as this sort of, philosophical or academic sort of pursuit. Like I could see it like, okay, I get it from a logical perspective and it totally makes sense. And like it provides that social fabric we need. What I've learned and really taken from this conversation is it actually gives a lot of economic power and political power as well, the more that we're all able to do that. So, it's not a one-to-one connection. You can't connect forming a strong community in your neighborhood to fighting the powers that be in Gaza. But if you're able to build your own food source so that you're not going to McDonald's, that is a small way to help support what's going on, to fight the suffering that's happening over there. So
You've heard the term like "fuck you" money before, right? Like, so it's like, what's the term? Fuck you community. Like we've got community, so we don't need your money.
There's the movement right there.
Yeah.
That's the new the fuck you community. I love it. That's great.
Oh, man.
I'll say this too, Kodie, just to your point of like ruining Sunday. Like, we're recording this on Sunday, but the power of this podcast and the work that, we're all trying to do is that these conversations are available for folks whenever, if they come across this later. We're willing to have these tough conversations on a Sunday morning so that way, the information will help someone as they're getting curious about what the heck's going on in Gaza. I feel like there's been a lot of propaganda around the Israeli side of things. Like, I want to look into that, and they do a Google search and they find the podcast, and then they start to listen, and maybe then they read the People's History of the United States, which you've brought up a couple times, Joe. It's like, I guess I look at this as not like look at us being heroes, being uncomfortable on a Sunday, but it's more like, I think this is important. These are important conversations to have, and hopefully if we can encourage one person to think differently or think more deeply about a topic, to do a little bit more research about what's going on, and to potentially reach out to build that community, that's all the better. I know I'm going to go knock on my neighbor's door today and say hello, and just those little acts. I think the more we're all able to do that, the better off we're all going to be.
That's a great segue to kind of close out the conversation today, Noah. Speaking of community, I'd love to plug the Adirondack Voters for Change up here in the Adirondacks. Great organization that is trying to build a community. They've got a ton of cool stuff that they do. They've got their weekly calendar you can check out. They have their rapid reaction teams as well. We are a small community up here in upstate New York in the Adirondacks, but there have been ice raids up here. We have a lot of dairy farms up in this area. So we're not insulated. We might feel insulated sometimes, but we're not. And so like what happens everywhere else affects us too. So yeah, I'd say if you're not super thrilled with how things are going, check out the Adirondack Voters for Change. We link to them on our website, but you can just Google them as well. You can get on their mailing list and you can kind of get involved with everything that they have going on. So that's my plug for the week. Anything that you guys would like to plug to close out here today?
I don't have much.
That works.
Read something, meditate, spend time with your community. I don't know. I don't have a good plug, but yeah, take care of yourself in a way that feels refreshing and allows you to take care of the people around you.
I like that. Check out independent media. Find a local news source that is doing good work, that's trying to build that community and clarity. If you're in our neck of the woods, or even if you're not, check us out at sierranevadaally.org. We do a lot of civic explainers, including things about the federal government. We have our own podcast that we do most weeks. I hesitate to say every week. Most weeks we have a podcast. So check us out at the Sierra Nevada Ally, and also support your local libraries, support your local public media institutions, especially with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting announcing that it's closing. So, media, valuable media, independent local media needs your help right now. So if there is a news source, an information source that is valuable to you, whether that's this podcast or other independent, particularly nonprofit sources, consider contributing financially if you're able, or at least spreading the word on the work that they're doing. Every bit helps. And like I said, support your libraries also. They could use your help too.
Absolutely. Every review, every share of those podcasts or shows or organizations. Unfortunately, we are still beholden to the corporate algorithm overlords. So we need to kind of game the system a little bit and make sure we're playing that game if we want to reach the widest audience. So yeah, please share. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we will talk to you next week. That's it for this week's episode. Thanks so much for listening and hanging out with us.
If you enjoy the show, help us spread the word. Leave a rating or review and share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think would get something out of these conversations.
Your ratings, reviews, and shares help this show grow, and the more people listening, the harder it is for propaganda to win.
So until next time,
stay aware, stay safe, and remember,
propaganda loves you.